Hello, my name is Dana Arbaugh, and I'll be giving you a brief overview of Discovery Learning. When I had to present on Discovery Learning for my Psychology of Music teaching class at Ithaca College, I had a difficult time finding supplemental resources that compared and contrasted Discovery Learning with Reception Learning, which is another significant strand in cognitivism. In most of the resources I found, Discovery Learning was presented as a subset of inquiry-based learning, which is a form of constructivism, so we'll explore that categorization as well. I hope that as a result of this video, you'll better understand what Discovery Learning is, when to best apply it, and the subtle differences between cognitivism and constructivism. Let's get started. Discovery learning is an active process of inquiry-based instruction that encourages learners to build on prior knowledge through experience and to search for new information and relationships based on their interests. Discovery learning came about through the discovery movement of the 1960s, which was largely influenced by Jerome Bruner. Now, let's look at the discovery learning process. Step 1. Present the problem. For example, if I wanted my elementary music students to learn to classify instruments, I would present them with several instruments that they could examine and ask them to come up with a way to group the instruments. Step 2. The child searches for answers. My students would get together and observe and handle the instruments. Maybe they would decide that gold instruments should be in one group and the instruments with 3 buttons should be in another group. Or maybe they would decide the instruments you can hit and instruments that have strings should be separated. Either way, the student is in the driver's seat as they search for the answers. Step 3. The child expresses their answers. My students would physically group the instruments by type and then share their findings with the class. Step 4. The process would be described by the student. My students would explain how they came to decide on a grouping system. Step 5. Their answers are compared, tested, discussed, and evaluated. This is where I would step in as their music teacher. We would compare and contrast our groupings with some other groupings. We would discuss pros and cons as a class, and I, their facilitator, would guide them. Step 6. New questions arise. A few questions that might come up are, what about those gold instruments that have reeds? And what about those instruments that have these mouthpieces that you buzz into? What if we classified instruments by what they're made out of? By that logic, wouldn't a clarinet and a violin both be wooden instruments? Step 7. Teacher planning. Now, I take that information and go forward. I adjust my lesson plans for the next class. Maybe this is a great time to begin exploring instrument families, or perhaps we could start to watch Peter and the Wolf. Discovery learning can be a successful method of guiding students to discover new knowledge, and because it's student-centered, the learning is more likely to stick. Now, let's compare and contrast discovery learning with reception learning. Reception learning is credited to Ausubel, who declared that teachers should be concerned with what their students already know so they can best determine what should be taught next. When utilizing reception learning, teachers are responsible for organizing the learning so that students can build meaningful cognitive structures through guidance. Teachers link the new content with what the student already knows. One of the most significant differences between reception learning and discovery learning are the roles of the learner and the teacher. In reception learning, the learner is passive while the teacher is active. In discovery learning, the learner is extremely active while the teacher serves as a facilitator. For those of you who have a background in learning theories, you might be wondering how discovery learning is different from constructivism. In discovery learning, the teacher knows what they want the student to learn, and they guide them to make that discovery on their own. There is structure and there are detailed objectives. For example, I knew that I wanted my students to discover some of the factors that go into classifying instruments. In constructivism, the teacher is open to what the student discovers. Students construct their own knowledge. They come to the table with their own experiences. Our schemata might not make sense to them, so they construct knowledge out of what they know. If I were utilizing a constructivist approach, my students would be free to pursue any path they found interesting while investigating the instruments I set out for them. Perhaps they were fascinated with how to produce sound on each of the instruments, and they weren't at all concerned with how we would group them. Now that we have an overview, how do you decide when to utilize these instructional methodologies? The bottom line is that, as Stephen Covey would say, you begin with the end in mind. You need to consider your objectives when deciding how to present new knowledge. Consider the objective of learning to fly a plane. We'll now hear from United States Navy Lieutenant Christopher Verona, a P-3 Orion pilot currently deployed with Patrol Squadron 4-7, about the complex objective of learning to fly an aircraft.
Hi, my name is Lieutenant Chris Verona, and I fly the mighty P-3 Orion. Learning to fly the plane is a really long process, and I didn't actually step foot into a real aircraft until I was already months into the training. We start off in the ground school phase, where everything is in a classroom, taken slowly, learning out of the textbook, learning with classroom lectures, taught by instructors, and doing PowerPoints on computers, taking tests. Once that was all finished, and we passed all our tests, and we were ready to move on, we moved into the simulator phase. Again, not the real aircraft, but a mock-up of the flight station where we learned to run through checklists, monitor aircraft systems and avionics, and again, run through procedures to starting engines and handle all malfunctions. After that, we finally stepped foot into the actual aircraft, and again, everything was taken step by step, very slow process. Procedures were briefed and rebriefed, and then instructors demonstrated all the procedures, and then after we felt comfortable enough, the student would actually take controls and for the first time actually fly the aircraft and perform the procedures. Everything very slow, methodical process, and anytime we learned something new and added a new step into our procedures, we'd start again at the beginning, learn again from the textbooks, some more classroom lectures, try to get in the sims, get all of our mistakes out of the way in the simulator, and then finally go into the plane. And over and over again, made lots of mistakes, but once we were in the plane and we got it down, you could finally sit back and enjoy the ride.
Thank you, Lieutenant Verona. Fair winds and following seas. Since the potential for disaster is extremely high when learning to fly an aircraft, Discovery Learning would not be the best instructional methodology. Even though the flight instructor has a clear objective in mind, there is a very specific, safe way to perform the skills necessary to remain at cruising altitude. If the student were allowed to learn through trial and error, their safety would be at risk. Now, let's consider a vastly different objective, learning to do sick tricks on a skateboard. Once upon a time, I was an amateur skateboarder. I don't really remember anyone formally teaching me how to shred though. I just go down to the skate park, mess around, and figure out some things like where to put my feet when I kickflip. Occasionally, some of the older shredders would drop by, help me with my kickflips, and then send me on my way. It was totally rad. Although skateboarding is a risky activity, it is not nearly as risky as learning to fly a plane. Additionally, I bet your average shredder would detest sitting in a classroom and learning how to ollie through a step-by-step presentation from a traditional teacher. Instead, you're much more likely to find them at the skate park, skating around and attempting super cool tricks. Their instruction would likely come in the form of some brief advice from a more advanced friend or a facilitator. Then, they'd get back at it, drop in, and give it a shot. Therefore, Discovery Learning would be a suitable instructional methodology for teaching a friend how to shred on his board. I hope that this presentation has been informative. Now, go out into the world and when safe, help others discover the means to shred. Rock on, my friends.